In the year 192, inside the largest arena Rome had ever built, the Emperor Commodus stepped into the sand dressed as a secutor, a heavily armored gladiator class built for hunting down the lightly armed net fighters called retiari. He had already killed ostriches with crescent-tipped arrows and beheaded a giraffe to entertain a crowd that didn't know whether to cheer or run. But the detail that historians kept recording, the detail carved into graffiti on the walls of Pompeii decades earlier and repeated by the Roman historian Cassius Dio, was that Commodus fought left-handed. He boasted about it. Gladiator schools trained their fighters almost exclusively to face right-handed opponents, because right-handed opponents were 9 out of every 10 men who ever picked up a sword. A left-handed fighter walked into the ring as a kind of glitch in the system, an opponent whose attacks came from the wrong side, whose shield sat where no one expected a shield to be. Roman combat training, whether for gladiators in a private school or legionaries in the army, drilled soldiers almost exclusively in facing an opponent whose sword arm was on the right, because that was the arm 9 out of 10 men would ever swing. A left-handed opponent broke that trained instinct in the space of a single exchange, and in an arena where a mistimed reaction meant a blade in the ribs, that broken instinct was worth real money. Graffiti scratched into the walls of gladiator barracks specifically flagged fighters as schiva, left-handed, the way a modern scouting report flags a pitcher who throws from the wrong side of the mound. It wasn't an insult in that context. It was a warning. Left-handed gladiators were paid more, booked more, and feared more because in a fight, being rare made you dangerous. And that single fact, that being in the minority in single combat gave you an edge precisely because everyone else had trained for someone else, is one of the strangest threads running through 2,000 years of human history. Because outside the arena, in nearly every temple, classroom, and household on Earth, that same 10% was treated as something to be corrected, punished, or exercised. The question that took genetics almost a century to answer is why? Why does roughly 1 in 10 people reach for the world with their left hand in every century of recorded history, in cultures that never had contact with each other, in defiance of relentless and often brutal efforts to stamp it out? And why, when scientists finally went looking for the gene responsible, did they find something so much stranger than a single gene at all? The number itself is the first mystery. Right around 10%, not 5, not 20, holds steady whether you're looking at cave paintings in Lascaux, medieval manuscripts from Canterbury, or a classroom in Kansas City today. And for nearly all of recorded history, that 10% paid a price for existing. The Latin word for left is sinister. In Arabic, the left hand is called the unclean hand, reserved for hygiene, never for eating or greeting. In Japanese, the older term for left-handedness, hidari kiki, carried an undertone of clumsiness and wrongness. Catholic schoolchildren in the mid-20th century had their left hands physically tied behind their backs to force right-handed writing. Islamic scholars debated whether eating with the left hand compromised the spiritual cleanliness of a meal. Hindu tradition assigned the left hand to bodily functions, considered too impure to bring near food or prayer. Across faiths and continents that shared no common ancestry of belief, left-handedness was treated the same way. Not as a neutral variation, but as a defect, a moral flaw, something sinister in the oldest sense of the word. Medieval European art routinely depicted demons and traitors, Judas among them, holding objects in their left hands, a visual shorthand any illiterate churchgoer could read instantly. In pre-modern China, the character for left carried associations with the inauspicious and the improper in formal ritual contexts, while the right was reserved for positions of honor at court and at the table. None of these traditions borrowed the idea from each other. They arrived at nearly identical conclusions independently, separated by oceans and centuries, which is itself a strange kind of evidence that something universal in human psychology, not just culture, made the left hand an easy target. And yet it never disappeared. Generation after generation of correction, ridicule, and outright violence, and still roughly 1 in 10 children in every new generation reached for a spoon, a pen, or sword with their left hand anyway. That persistence is a clue. It tells you this isn't a bad habit or a failure of discipline. It's something written into the body before the body ever had a choice in the matter. But here's the question that genetics couldn't answer for decades. If left-handedness is biological, why couldn't anyone find the gene? Why does it run in families without following clean, predictable inheritance? Why do identical twins, who share effectively all of their DNA, sometimes end up with different dominant hands? The story of how science finally cracked this isn't just about which hand you write with. It's a case study in how modern genetics has quietly overturned the whole idea of a gene for anything, and the implications reach far past handedness. For most of the 20th century, the argument split into 2 camps, and the fight between them generated a surprising amount of heat for a debate about which hand butters the toast. The biological camp had evidence that was hard to wave away. Left-handedness clusters tightly in families. If both of your parents are left-handed, your own odds of being left-handed roughly double compared to the general population. Identical twins share handedness more often than fraternal twins, though far from perfectly, and that stubborn 10% shows up across cultures with wildly different attitudes toward left hands, which suggests something running deeper than social pressure. So the biological determinists said, it's genetic, simple, we just need to find the gene. Except they couldn't. Study after study went looking for a single handedness gene and came back empty. The inheritance patterns were too messy. Too many left-handed kids were born to two right-handed parents. Too many genetically identical twins ended up discordant. Whatever was driving this, it refused to behave like a normal Mendelian trait. Researchers spent years chasing individual candidate genes that seemed promising in small studies, genes involved in language lateralization and early brain patterning, only to watch the associations shrink or vanish entirely once tested in larger, better-powered samples. Family pedigree studies going back to the 1970s and 80s tried fitting handedness to simple recessive or dominant inheritance models, and none of the models fit the data cleanly, no matter how researchers adjusted the assumptions. It was a trait that behaved as though it were heritable, clustering in families exactly the way blood type or eye color does, while stubbornly refusing to be traced to any single stretch of chromosome, which is precisely the kind of contradiction that keeps a scientific question open for decades instead of months. The environmental camp pounced on that failure. They pointed to birth stress, prenatal hormone exposure, forced conditioning in childhood. Some researchers went so far as to frame left-handedness as a minor developmental disruption, something faintly pathological. Others treated it more gently as a learned behavior that could simply be unlearned, which is exactly what generations of teachers attempted, with varying and often cruel degrees of success. The cultural argument even had theological scaffolding behind it. If the right hand was across multiple religious traditions, the hand of blessing, of oath-taking, of divine favor, then the left hand represented a deviation from a designed order, not a random accident of biology. In Arabic, the word for right, yamin, shares a root with words meaning blessing, oath, and certainty. The left carried the opposite charge, doubt, impurity, the hand you did not extend to a guest. Religious communities weren't being arbitrary when they stigmatized left-handedness. They were operating inside a coherent framework where the body itself had a divinely intended architecture, and that architecture privileged the right. So which was it? Genes or design, biology or upbringing? The honest answer is that geneticists expected this to be a tidy story. One gene, maybe two, a few environmental modifiers, case closed. And what they found instead turned into one of the more genuinely fascinating windows into how DNA actually works, and it wasn't a blueprint. It was something far more collaborative and far more humble than the deterministic story we've usually been sold. The breakthrough didn't come from finally isolating one gene. It came from giving up the search for one gene entirely. In 2019, a team led by Dr. Akira Weiberg at the University of Oxford published a landmark study in the journal Brain, drawing on genetic and brain imaging data from roughly 400,000 participants in the UK Biobank, one of the largest genetic databases in the world. Using a subset of about 9,000 of those participants who also had detailed brain scans, the researchers identified 4 genomic regions significantly associated with left-handedness. 4 regions, not one gene. And crucially, those regions weren't coding for hand muscles or motor neurons in any direct way. They were tied to brain development, specifically to genes like MAPP2 and MAPT, which help build the cytoskeleton, the internal scaffolding of developing brain cells, along with genes such as WNT3 involved in patterning how the brain's structures take shape. The imaging data showed that left-handed participants had stronger functional connectivity between the language networks on the left and right sides of the brain, differences traceable to the white matter tracks, the wiring laid down by these same cytoskeletal genes during fetal development. This was a genuine revelation. Left-handedness, it turned out, was never really about hands. It was about how the brain builds its asymmetric architecture in the earliest weeks after conception. But here is what should stop you cold. Those 4 regions, combined, explained only a small fraction of who ends up left-handed, nowhere close to the whole picture. A larger follow-up study published the following year, combining data from the UK Biobank, the consumer genetics company 23andMe, and the International Handedness Consortium, more than one. 7 million people in total, expanded the list of associated genetic regions to 41 distinct loci. 41, not one. And the genes clustering around those loci kept returning to the same theme. Microtubule formation, the physical scaffolding proteins that let brain cells take shape and migrate into position, genes like TUB-B3, TUBA1B, and NME7, the last of which, remarkably, can also cause organs on the wrong side of the body entirely when mutated. Even with all 41 regions combined, the total genetic contribution to handedness remains modest. Multiple independent twin studies comparing identical twins who share essentially all of their DNA against fraternal twins who share only about half converge on a heritability estimate for handedness of roughly 25%, not 0, not 100, 25%. That figure is what finally explained the twin discordance that had puzzled researchers for so long. If handedness were driven mostly by shared genes, identical twins should match far more often than they actually do. Which means 3/4 of what decides your dominant hand isn't sitting in your DNA sequence at all. Let me put that in terms that might land if you've ever taken one of those consumer, ancestry, or genetic tests. If you're left-handed and both of your parents are right-handed, which describes the majority of left-handed people on Earth, your DNA isn't broken and it isn't deficient. Your DNA handed you a probability, a leaning, a set of odds, and something else entirely tipped you over the line into that 10%. The genes identified so far cluster overwhelmingly around brain asymmetry, microtubule construction, and early neurological development, which paints a picture of a trait shaped not by one gene with a clean on-off switch, but by a vast chorus of genetic variants, each one whispering rather than shouting, each one individually negligible and collectively decisive. Geneticists call this polygenicity, and it's turning out to be the rule for most of the traits that make us who we are, rather than the exception. And if the genetic story already sounds complicated, the evolutionary question underneath it is even more interesting because that stubborn 10% demands an explanation on its own. If left-handedness were purely a disadvantage, as centuries of religious and cultural stigma insisted, natural selection should have quietly erased it a long time ago. It hasn't. If it were simply neutral, random genetic drift should have pushed that percentage around wildly between different populations over tens of thousands of years. It hasn't done that either. 10%, stubbornly, globally, generation after generation. That kind of stable minority frequency is the signature of what evolutionary biologists call balancing selection, a situation where being rare is itself the advantage, because the rest of the population has calibrated its instincts, training, and expectations around fighting, working, and competing against the majority. The clearest evidence for this comes from combat, both ancient and modern. Beyond the gladiator arenas of Rome, where Sceva fighters commanded higher fees precisely because their attacks came from the unexpected side, modern researchers have gone looking for the same pattern in the anthropological record. In 2005, French researchers Charlotte Fourie and Michel Raymond published a study in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, B, examining the rate of left-handedness across a range of traditional, non-industrialized societies. What they found was striking. The frequency of left-handers tracked closely with the homicide rate of the society in question, ranging from as low as 3% left-handed in the most peaceful, low-violent societies studied, up to 27% in the most violent and warlike ones. Their conclusion was that in societies where hand-to-hand violence was a routine part of life, left-handed fighters carried a built-in surprise advantage because most training, reflexes, and combat instruction in any population is unconsciously calibrated for right-handed opponents. The rarer left-handers become, the sharper their advantage, and the sharper their advantage, the more that rarity gets preserved rather than bred out. It's a self-stabilizing loop, exactly the kind of mechanism that would hold a trait at a fixed minority percentage instead of letting it drift toward 0 or toward 50-50. The finding has drawn some methodological criticism over the years, particularly around sample size, but it lines up with a broader and better supported pattern documented in modern interactive sports, fencing, boxing, and baseball among them, where left-handers are consistently overrepresented relative to their share of the general population, and where that overrepresentation grows sharply in sports involving direct, fast, reactive confrontation between two opponents rather than sports where an athlete competes against a clock or a fixed target. Fencing tournaments regularly see left-handed competitors make up a share of top finishers well above their 10% baseline in the general population. For the same underlying reason, a left-handed gladiator unsettled a right-handed opponent nearly 2,000 years earlier. Most training, muscle memory, and split-second reaction time in any sport gets calibrated, consciously or not, around facing a right-handed opponent and a left-handed attacker breaks that calibration in real time. But a straightforward combat advantage almost certainly isn't the whole story, because the genes tied to left-handedness don't appear to do just one job. There's growing evidence that the cytoskeletal genes implicated in handedness are pleiotropic, meaning a single gene variant can influence more than one trait at once. Some of the same genetic architecture bound up in brain lateralization also shows up in genes tied to language processing and spatial reasoning, cognitive capacities that would have mattered regardless of which hand someone favored. In other words, the same genetic lottery that occasionally produces a left-handed brain might, in different combinations, be quietly contributing to cognitive flexibility that benefits the whole population. Some researchers studying language networks have noted that left-handers, as a group, show somewhat more evenly distributed language processing across both hemispheres of the brain, rather than concentrating it almost entirely on one side, the pattern typical of most right-handers. Whether that produces any measurable real-world cognitive advantage on average is still genuinely debated in the literature, and no legitimate study supports the popular myth that left-handers are simply smarter or more creative as a group, but the underlying neurological difference in how the brain organizes itself is real, well-documented, and traceable back to the very same handful of cytoskeletal genes driving hand preference in the first place. There's a cost side to this ledger too. Left-handedness shows up at slightly elevated rates in populations with higher incidences of certain neurodevelopmental conditions, including schizophrenia, autism spectrum conditions, and dyslexia. This doesn't mean left-handedness causes any of these conditions. It means the same underlying genetic complexity that governs how the brain organizes itself asymmetrically can, in some configurations, tip toward atypical neurological development. This is balancing selection at its most honest, not a clean story of pure advantage, but a population-level trade-off, where maintaining genetic variation produces a more cognitively diverse and more adaptable species overall, even when that same variation occasionally produces individually costly outcomes. Evolution, it turns out, doesn't optimize for any one person. It hedges. Here's a detail that I think makes this whole picture even more remarkable. In 2017, Sebastian Aucklenberg and colleagues at Ruhr University Bochum in Germany published research in the journal eLife examining gene expression in the spinal cords of postmortem human embryos, ranging from 4 to 8 weeks after conception. What they found was that asymmetries in gene expression between the left and right sides of the developing spinal cord were already present as early as 8 weeks post-conception, before the motor cortex in the brain has even finished forming a functional connection down to the spine. In other words, before the brain has any say in the matter at all. Human fetuses already show a measurable tendency to move their right arms more than their left arms at this stage, driven entirely by signals originating in the spinal cord, not the brain. The hand you eventually write with may effectively be decided before your brain is developed enough to have an opinion about it. Your spinal cord makes the first call. And the mechanism behind that asymmetry wasn't simple genetic sequence at all. It was epigenetic, patterns of DNA methylation, essentially molecular tags that switch gene activity up or down without altering the underlying DNA code, distributed asymmetrically between the left and right sides of the developing spinal cord, regulated in part by microRNA activity in the same signaling pathways that guide early tissue growth. This matters enormously for the twin discordance puzzle that stumped researchers for decades, because it means that even genetically identical twins sharing 100% of their DNA can end up with different dominant hands. Their positions in the womb differed. Their blood supply and microenvironment differed. The random molecular noise during early cell division differed. Same genome, different epigenome, different outcome. The researchers behind the study were careful to note that this doesn't mean the brain plays no later role in handedness at all. Cortical asymmetries do develop further in subsequent weeks of gestation, and likely reinforce or occasionally override the initial spinal signal. But the discovery pushed the true starting point of handedness weeks earlier than anyone had previously demonstrated, and located it in a part of the nervous system, the spinal cord, that almost no earlier theory of handedness had seriously considered as the origin point. It isn't nature versus nurture, and it isn't even nature plus nurture in the simple sense people usually mean. It's nature setting a probability, and then the sheer physical reality of one particular body developing inside another particular body, resolving that probability into an outcome no algorithm could have predicted in advance. So where does that leave the religious and cultural traditions that spent centuries treating left-handedness as a mark against the body? It's worth being careful here, because these weren't arbitrary superstitions. The right-hand preference embedded in Islamic practice, Hindu ritual, and Christian symbolism reflected coherent theological systems that organized moral and physical life for millions of people across enormous stretches of time, and did so, on their own terms, quite effectively. These weren't fringe beliefs held by a handful of isolated communities either. They shaped the daily physical habits of a meaningful share of the world's population for well over 1,000 years, and in some households and schools they still do today, in gentler form. But we now know something those traditions had no way of knowing. Handedness isn't a choice, and it was never a failure of character or discipline. It's a trait set in motion inside the womb, nudged along by dozens of scattered genetic loci, shaped by epigenetic forces that no parent, priest, or teacher could have controlled, and preserved across the whole species by evolutionary pressures that have been quietly operating for hundreds of thousands of years. That 10% was never sinister. It was never broken. It was, and still is, a population-level hedge against cognitive uniformity, a reservoir of neurological variation that has served the species even while it cost individual left-handers dearly in stigma, ridicule, and forced correction. And here's maybe the most striking part of what modern genetics has revealed. DNA doesn't draw a clean line between left-handers and right-handers at all. There's no binary switch buried in a chromosome somewhere. There's a continuum of brain lateralization, a spectrum, and where any one person lands on that spectrum is the product of thousands of small genetic signals colliding with the unrepeatable, one-time physics of that person's own prenatal development. The old instinct to sort the world into pure and impure, blessed and sinister, right and wrong, runs straight into a biological reality that simply refuses to be sorted that cleanly. What genetics has ultimately revealed about left-handedness might be the clearest small parable for what genetics is revealing about almost everything that makes us who we are. We want single causes. We want a clean, traceable line of inheritance. We want to point at one gene and say, there, that's the reason. And for a handful of traits, eye color, blood type, a small number of single gene diseases, that kind of clean story genuinely holds up. But for the traits that feel most essentially, unmistakably us, temperament, cognitive style, and yes, handedness, genetics delivers something closer to a weather forecast than a blueprint. Probabilities, tendencies, a set of likelihoods that the irreducible randomness of biological development ultimately resolves in one direction or another. 25% heritable, 41 loci identified and counting, none of them deterministic, all of them whispering. And the other 75%, the epigenetic marks laid down inside the womb, the molecular noise of early cell division, the unrepeatable circumstances of one particular pregnancy, isn't written in your genes at all. It's written in your story. The specific and unrepeatable story of one body becoming itself inside another body, and all the molecular coin flips that happened along the way. If you're left-handed, your DNA gave you a somewhat higher probability of ending up that way. But it was your own particular unrepeatable developing body that made the final call, weeks before you were even born, long before anyone could tie your hand behind your back or hand you a pen and tell you which way to hold it. That 10% was never an error in the code. It was the code doing exactly what evolution built it to do, preserving variation, keeping options open across the species, refusing to let humanity settle into the brittle sameness of only ever having one way of being in the world. Left-handedness was never a deviation from some human template. It's proof that there was never only one template to begin with. Every left-handed child tying their shoes with the wrong hand, every left-handed student forced to switch a pencil into the correct grip, every left-handed fighter who ever stepped into an arena and unsettled an opponent, trained for someone else entirely, was living out a piece of biology that wouldn't be understood for 2,000 years. The fighters in the Roman arena who commanded higher fees for coming at the world from the unexpected side knew that on a gut level, long before anyone had a microscope powerful enough to see a gene, let alone sequence one, and long before anyone could trace that 10% all the way back to a scrap of tissue in an 8-week-old spinal cord, quietly deciding, cell by cell, which hand a person would spend the rest of their life reaching out with.